Scared? I can see you from behind. You can hear me in your mind. Run so fast as you can go. Time will catch you before you know.
Thanksgiving night a couple of years ago, I was sitting in my parents' family room watching a movie when my younger sister burst through the door, hysterical. I asked her what was wrong, but she was panicking to the point she couldn't speak. She just kept trying to call her boyfriend. After calming down, she explained to us that while she was driving home on a dark, somewhat secluded road, a couple of creeps began harassing her. They were driving uncomfortably close behind her, and then they tried running her off the road. She called her boyfriend, who came to her rescue by getting the guy's attention. My sister made it home, but she was worried about her boyfriend because he wasn't answering his phone. After calling again and again, he finally picked up his phone. My sister overheard some of the conversation he was having with these jerks, and she heard someone say something about a gun. She freaked out, and my parents called the police and took her down to meet with her boyfriend and a cop. Apparently, the guys were drunk and had pulled a gun on her boyfriend. They found them and hopefully punished them accordingly. People are idiots. So last year, the day after Thanksgiving, I had to be at work at 8 in the morning. I don't drive, so I had to take the train, which meant that I had to be at the station by 6 a.m. I couldn't find my jacket, and I knew it was going to be cold, but it doesn't get super cold where I am, so I just grabbed a throw blanket and started walking. I was almost to the platform for the train, and I had just barely missed the first train that would have gotten me to work slightly early when a guy got off the train. He started yelling stuff at me, but I had headphones in, so I don't know what he all said. He was riding his bike in the opposite direction, so I didn't think too much of it and just kept walking. All of a sudden, the guy flies up behind me and he almost hit me with his bike. He started cussing at me, asking why the hell I had my beautiful body wrapped up in a blanket in this cold-ass weather. Then he offered me his coat, but I said no thanks and that I was fine. All of a sudden, out of the blue, he asks if anyone has ever gone down on me. I was so stunned that I couldn't say anything. Then he said, "I'll do it for free." At that point, I gained my composure and just said, "I'm leaving now," and he said some other vulgar things as I was walking away. I was so freaked out at that point, I was shaking, and I was so thankful that he had left me alone after I walked away, because there weren't any houses or cars around, and the only buildings were businesses, but no one would have been open there quite yet. It was Thanksgiving 2011, and I was celebrating at my grandparents' farm in the little town of Sevilla, Florida. I had had way too much to eat that holiday, and was about to leave to drive back to school in Tallahassee. I stopped at the one little gas station in town to fill up before getting on the highway. I had just finished filling up when a lady walked up to me. She was really ratty looking with crazy blonde dyed hair. But this is the backwoods of Florida, so no judgment. There were really kind people who looked like that in those parts. She started talking to me about how her car had run out of gas. She pointed to an old junker parked over near the convenience store, and if I could possibly give her some cash to get home. I usually don't say yes to things like that, but it was Thanksgiving weekend, so I was feeling extra generous. I told her that I'd be happy to fill up her car a little to get her home. Then it started getting weird. She kept insisting I give her cash and that the car was so empty she couldn't drive it to a pump. I don't know why I didn't leave right then and there, but again, I was in a very good mood. I told her if she had a gas can, I would put some in, but I didn't feel comfortable giving her cash. She kept objecting, but eventually went over and pulled a gas can from her car. I started filling it up. She put her hand on me and said, "Do you have a girlfriend?" I told her no, politely. She said she wanted to pay me back somehow for the gas and asked if I wanted to come to her place. I told her no, less politely. She kept touching my shoulder, thanking me, and then offered me a blowjob behind the station, so I stopped the gas pump, got in my car, and left her there with the gas can. I called my mom a little later and told her about the creepy, sleazy encounter. She paused and asked me if this lady had ratty blonde hair and looked like she was on drugs. I confirmed that yes, that is what she looked like, and how could she know that? This lady was apparently all over the news. She was a prostitute in town and had been at a party earlier. An exchange had gone south, and her baby had been kidnapped by a client of hers and left under a bush in town. She hadn't even bothered to call the police about the missing child until later. They were both arrested, and they were both charged. This all took place back in November of last year. I booked an entire trip in order to propose to my then girlfriend. I flew us both to Florida to go to Disney World and to the last concert of one of my favorite bands, Amberlin, and of course propose. We had a blast. I proposed in the Disney castle. She said yes, and everything went well. We took off the next morning, Thanksgiving Day, on the way home connecting through San Francisco. About 30 minutes into the flight, the captain comes on the intercom and announces that one of the engines wasn't depressurizing properly. We do a loop back to the airport and get unloaded into the terminal as we wait for another plane to be ready. When we got to the terminal, my now fiancée switched her phone back from airplane mode, and within a minute she had 10 plus voicemails, all from the same number, which she didn't know. Fearing the worst, we called the number without listening to any of the voicemails. I knew something was wrong as soon as she started talking to them. Her face went blank, and she didn't say a word. I told her to give me the phone, and she did. I asked who it was, and the voice I heard back just sounded dead. Absolutely no hint of emotion to it. All he said was, "I will kill both of you as soon as you land in Seattle." I asked who he was again, and he just hung up. She said she had no idea who it was, and I certainly didn't know the voice. I called him back, and when he would answer, he would just repeat the time that we were landing. Little did he know that we were delayed hours. I used to work in telecom, and I pulled some strings to get a name and address from the phone number that he used. Neither of us knew the name nor the address. She looked him up on Facebook, and she had one mutual friend with him, her ex-best friend, who we'll call Karen, that she was no longer friends with as she got wrapped up in heavy drug usage and stole from my fiancé. We did a little more digging and found out he was the boyfriend of Karen's new best friend. My theory is Karen saw the post that my fiancé was posting on social media about the trip, the engagement, and the great time we were having, and she was pissed and wanted to piss on our parade. I didn't take it as a joke, however. A death threat is a death threat, and in my mind as meth heads, they could follow through with it on a whim. I called him and talked over his rambling and told him I was armed, knew where he lived, and was not afraid to take things into my own hands. He hung up on me, so I called the Seattle area law enforcement, and they told me to call back on a non-holiday. So I called the emergency line, and they reiterated the same statement. We were on our own. We ended up flying in close to 9 hours after our original arrival time. Once we landed, we both had a single voicemail. Hers I assumed was from the guy, and mine I had no idea, as he hadn't been calling my phone. My voicemail was from my dad, who said he had gotten a call from my neighbors saying that my mailbox had been destroyed, looked like it had been hit by a car and the mail stolen from it. Her voicemail, however, was the guy screaming, Where were you? How dare you? And plenty of other threats and random yelling. I drove home and dropped off my fiancée at her house, insisting she not come with me to my place in case there was someone still there. They threw a brick through my window with an old picture of my fiancé and Karen attached to it. I tried calling him, to no answer. I went to bed after covering up the window with a tarp and making sure my fiancé was okay. I filed a police report the next day. They said I couldn't do anything without seeing them on my property. We blocked everyone involved on social medias and went about our lives. I didn't hear from him for 3 weeks when he sent me a picture of my fiancée working. I immediately called her and told her to go in the back of her work, a bubble tea shop. I then called mall security and explained the situation, but by the time they got to the food court where the picture was taken from, he was gone. At this point I was done messing around. I knew his address and swung by and dropped off a note attached to a critical defense .40 caliber bullet saying, "This is your last chance to leave her alone. This is your only warning." It's been almost 9 months now. Haven't heard a word or seen them again. But for both of our sakes, I sincerely hope not to meet him. I decided to post the story of my best friend and what her life is like with a stalker. She knew him through a mutual friend. He lived in Delaware. We live in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He came to visit his friend, met her once, then decided to move here. After he had lived here for 6 months, they began dating. 3 months into them dating, he admitted he had moved here because he wanted to be closer to her, even though they weren't romantically involved at the time. Before they ever dated, he asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said that she likes stars, so just something with stars on it. He literally bought her a star in the sky and named it Tara. It was also accompanied with a very intense and creepy love letter. She didn't see it as a warning sign and liked the attention. I told her that it was overboard and creepy. The first week of them dating, he began going through her phone and purse at every opportunity. She was furious and told him her phone is private. She said he should only snoop if he had a good reason to do so, not just because he wants to keep tabs on who she texts. She puts a lock on her phone, but it doesn't take long for him to figure out the lock code. He didn't admit to going through her phone again, but she knew he was, because he would always seem to bring up a person that may have texted her that day, or the subject that was spoken of. Some phone numbers of her closet guy friends had been changed in her phone as well. He wouldn't let her go anywhere without him. He would make plans for her every single day of the week, and then make her promise to follow through with the plans, even though they lived together. If she ever went back on the plans because something else came up that she wanted to do, he would throw a fit and say that she's a liar because she didn't keep her promise. It was things like she had promised to eat dinner at home with him, small things, and he would often react violently. She became increasingly agitated with his controlling and smothering behavior, and told him that she wanted to go have girl time with me, that she needs some breathing space for a night. He made her promise to let him come if he would hang out with other people. About an hour before she was coming to meet me, I got a phone call from a friend that had moved across the country. He was in town and wanted to see me. I told him that I would have a friend with me that night, but we'd swing by his house for about an hour if she was okay with it. I asked Tara if she's cool with it, and she says of course. A few minutes later, I get a text from him asking if he could come because of the promise that Tara had made to him. I said I'm sorry, but I don't think it's acceptable. This is a friend that I haven't seen in several years, and I'm already taking one person over to his mom's house that he doesn't know. It would be rude to bring another. We're only staying there for about an hour anyways. A few minutes after, Tara texts and says she's walking out her door. She never makes it to my house. I called and texted, but couldn't get her. I finally get just one text from her that simply said, "Help." I immediately drove to her apartment, where I found her on her balcony. He had stolen her phone and locked her on her balcony so she couldn't leave. They broke up for a while, and I guess out of being lonely she got back with him. One night he burst through my front door unannounced because he hadn't talked to Tara in 30 minutes. She went to dinner with a family friend, and he was following her and spying on her. Her phone had died. He panicked when he lost track of her. He freaked out in my living room and accused me of lying for her. I also found out that he had saved the numbers of all the guys she had in her phone. I told him he was not allowed to be near me again, even if Tara was with him. He seemed to act normal for a while, until Tara became pregnant. He was ecstatic, and she was scared. After about a week, she started getting excited about being a parent. That was until she started adding some things up. Her birth control had mysteriously vanished not long before she got pregnant. He was giving her vitamins every day and watching her take them. He said she needed to take them because she was anemic. She looked up the pills, and they were for fertility. She also remembered a few times he had said he was wearing a condom, and she didn't think it felt like one was there. He had been trying to get her pregnant. She understandably chose not to keep the baby after finding this out. She was terrified of him after this. He would have used the baby as a way to get to Tara. It would have meant nothing more to him, and they split again. He still lived in their apartment after they split, and she would drop by here and there to get some of her stuff. He seemed to be handling things okay, until Thanksgiving. He threw her all over the apartment when she stopped by for her stuff. That night he said he was going to spend the night out of town in Nashville, and that he needed Tara to stay there and watch his puppy. She made sure it had food and water, but didn't want to be there in case he came back. He did. At 1 a.m. she gets dozens of phone calls from him. He was never in Nashville. He was trying to get her alone and flipped his shit when she wasn't there. He sent her over 115 texts in 1 minute that all said, "Respond to me." He began driving by her work and house all the time. He would call and text her incessantly. He told her that he wasn't promising his sanity or her safety, that he would kill her. He started taking her mail. I told her that I would go get her mail for her, but he said he wouldn't give it to me. He'd only give it to her if she came in person. He began threatening me and saying that it was my fault. Yes, I had encouraged her to get away from him. He was insane, and everyone was scared for her. She was living at my house because he didn't know where I lived at the time. I finally decided to treat him like a kid, and I called his mother in Delaware. I told her of his behavior and threats and asked if she could help him. He ended up moving back to Delaware, but would still call and text Tara all the time. He also made sure to bash her to every person she knew. He would come back to town often. He would go places where her friends worked. He would drive by her work. He would send her gifts. Sometimes she'd see him waiting outside of places she was at. It finally stopped. She had a year of silence from him. She had even moved to a different state with the guy she was dating. Her and her boyfriend split, and she moved back home to Chattanooga to start working at a hotel. He came into her hotel and bought a room for the night. The next morning he checked out and drove back to Delaware. He drove 12 hours to stay at her hotel for one night, and then turned around and went back. He sent her a text a few months ago saying he's moving back there. For several years, she has constantly been on edge. She gets nervous if she sees a car like his. She has the genuine fear that he will hurt her if he gets the opportunity. She thinks he'll kill her one day. And I'm also afraid that he will. She has numerous police reports over this guy. I hate seeing how he's damaged her, and she's afraid to get close to another guy. She doesn't want kids now. She's always nervous. And we still use the buddy system. She doesn't go anywhere at all by herself. It only takes one moment of her being alone for him to get to her. Learn the warning signs. Learn what to do if you are being stalked. Don't ever let your life turn into what hers has.
For a little context, I am currently a senior in college and live off campus with my two best friends. This time of year, particularly around Thanksgiving, my friends try to help me stay busy as it is typically a difficult time for me. My mother left our family the week of Thanksgiving when I was 8 years old, and my dad passed away 5 years ago on November 22nd. So as I said, it's a pretty easy time of year to get myself down in the dumps if I don't stay active. Every year for the last 3 or 4 years, I have gone to one of my friends' houses to celebrate Thanksgiving with their families. But this past year I decided I wanted to just stay home and have a mellow long weekend. I figured I could catch up on work as well as my schoolwork, which was pretty far behind. My roommates and I didn't live particularly close to the university. We lived in a suburb about 15 to 20 minutes outside of the school. This was nice because we didn't ever have to host any parties. We could just attend them near campus and head back home afterwards. Anyways, there was one house on our street that didn't quite match the others. It wasn't that the house was worse than the others, but it had no landscaping and desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. My roommates and I knew the owner as he introduced himself when we moved in a few years back. His name is Jacob. He's about 5'6" and probably weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. Every time we've had an interaction with him, he was always very nice and polite. He even helped us fix our porch light when it broke last summer. He seems to be very cordial with everyone in the neighborhood and has helped numerous people with small handy jobs similar to the one I just mentioned. On the Wednesday night leading up to Thanksgiving, my two roommates went back to their families' houses in their hometowns. They both asked several times if I was 100% sure I wanted to spend Thanksgiving alone and that I'd be fine by myself. I honestly thought I would be, and thought perhaps enough time had passed that I could just focus on other things and not dwell on the past. I stocked up on Mountain Dew so I could stay awake after my assignments to play some PlayStation. At about 9 or 10 p.m., I went up to my room to throw on some sweatpants and grab the blanket for my bed. I glanced out my window and saw Jacob sitting on his front porch with the two porch lights on. I didn't think anything of it and went downstairs into the kitchen and made a peanut butter and fluff sandwich. I would say I was in the kitchen for probably about 5 minutes or so, finishing eating and doing a few dishes. When I finally sat down to play some games, I thought I heard something hit the front bay window, so I went to take a look. At first, I didn't see anything, but then noticed that Jacob had now turned the porch lights off and was standing on his front lawn, staring at the house with his head tilted like he was looking towards the windows upstairs. A little creeped out, I tried calling one of my friends who knew I was still in town to see if she wanted to meet up or stop over to hang out for a little bit. She didn't answer, so I sat on the couch for a couple of moments trying to figure out what to do. He was still standing there staring and seemingly moving a few feet closer to our property each time I looked. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't call the cops. He hadn't done anything except freak me out a little, and to this point, he hadn't even stepped on my property. After another few minutes, I looked out the window again and saw Jacob now on our lawn looking at the corner of the house. At least that's what it looked like he was staring at. At this point, I wasn't sure what his intentions were, and I didn't want to find out. Perhaps I was blowing this out of proportion, but I was legitimately scared. I grabbed my keys and phone and a few other items, thinking I would just drive to campus. Maybe the library was still open, even though we were off for the holiday. I kept all the lights on so I didn't seem like I was leaving and decided I was going to sneak out the back door. As I quietly sneaked through the yard, I turned the corner to quickly get to my car, and there was Jacob, standing in our driveway. I asked him what he was doing in the driveway, and he put his finger over his mouth to make a shh noise. I slapped him as hard as I could and made a run for it past my car. My instincts and adrenaline told me to just run until I found someone or someplace else. As I got about a block or two down the road, I saw a bunch of cop cars pull up towards the area of my house. Confused, I began to go back towards my house, thinking perhaps another neighbor saw Jacob stalking outside of my house and called the police. As I approached the house, one of the officers asked my name and if this was my residence. I confirmed the information, and what I heard next is still the most horrifying and disturbing information I had ever received. The officer stated that Jacob reported that he was on his porch when he saw me from across the street. He saw me walk out of my upstairs bedroom, and as I walked away out of the room, he saw a man come out of my closet. Apparently that was why Jacob was looking into my room when I saw him the first time, and also why he was looking at the corner of the house. He was following the intruder who was now walking into my roommate's room. When I last saw him outside my house before I slapped him and ran in terror, Jacob stated that the random guy in my house had made it to the downstairs. Jacob was trying not to make any noise as not to alert the person inside, fearful he could be violent or dangerous. As soon as he saw the man in the house, Jacob called the authorities and did his best to try and defuse the situation and not bring any alarm to myself or the intruder. The person inside the house was arrested and taken away. He didn't have anything on him other than a knife, so it is unclear if he was attempting to rob the home or was planning something more sinister. Either way, I couldn't express to Jacob how much gratitude I had for what he did. He even tried apologizing for how he handled the situation, stating that there were probably things he could have done differently to make sure I was safe and aware of the situation. Unfortunately, this experience adds another mental scar to this time of year that will take a long time to get over. But one thing I can be sure of is that I will never spend a Thanksgiving holiday alone again. I will try to do my best to explain this occurrence exactly how I remember it, including as much detail as possible. Currently, I am in my 30s, but was still in college at the time of this experience. I went to college on the other side of the country of where I grew up. Being on a college student budget, I usually couldn't afford to fly home on Thanksgiving. But this year, I had some extra cash and really wanted to make it home to see my parents. When I landed back on the East Coast, I was greeted by my parents and brother. I was so overcome with emotion and elated to see them and be able to spend some time with them. We spent the day together and went to my favorite steakhouse on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. As you probably know, that Wednesday is a big party night out for people who return home to see their families. My brother was a little bummed I didn't want to go, but I was a bit jet-lagged and didn't feel like going out. Sleeping that night was more difficult than I thought. I felt exhausted, but kept tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or fall asleep. While I was away for school, my parents sold our childhood home. They were in the process of buying a new one and were living in a small but rather nice apartment. The apartment sat on top of some local shops and, I believe, a restaurant. It really was a nice place, just too small for 4 adults. The next day, we had an awesome Thanksgiving meal together. We laughed and joked around, just like we used to when we were younger. After dinner, we cleaned up and put everything away and sat in the living room and told stories, continuing with the nostalgic theme of the day. However, the amazing atmosphere started to evaporate rather quickly when we heard the lady next door screaming and seemingly flipping out. The building my parents lived in had 2 apartments in it. You walked into the entrance on the ground level and used the staircase to get upstairs, and there was 2 apartments directly across from each other. My parents' apartment was on the left side and their neighbor, obviously, on the right. When our conversation got quiet, I asked my dad about the lady across the hall. He said she was always pleasant and very quiet for the most part, but apparently that was not the case tonight. She was screaming every cuss word you can imagine, just absolutely shrieking. We didn't hear another voice, so we figured she must have been on the phone. At first we tried to ignore it until we hear her say, "I swear I will kill you." She said this in the most menacing and stern voice I had ever heard. After that line and a previous 20 minutes of vulgarity, my mom decided to call the police. It seemed like they didn't really want to, but were unsure of what to do about the situation. No one wanted to go over and knock on the door to talk to her, so this seemed like the only other conclusion. Shortly after my mom hung up the phone with the police, we heard the most gut-curdling scream. It sounded like the life had been sucked out of her body and was making her last gasp to survive. After that scream, we didn't hear anything. We sat in silence and looked at each other, all of us scared, uneasy. I had no clue what to do. My brother and my dad decided that they had to knock on her door to see if she was okay. My mother and I stood in our doorway as we watched them walk over, curious to see what would transpire. After a couple of seconds, a big guy answered the door. Surprising, as we hadn't heard another person's voice the entire time. This guy was bald, clean-shaven, and had somewhat of a beer belly. He said in a loud, aggressive voice, "What do you want?" My dad responded with, "We just heard a lot of noise and wanted to make sure everything and everyone was okay." The man quickly retorted with, "We're fine," and slammed the door in my dad's face. As they came back into the apartment, my parents said that they had never seen that man before and stated we needed to lock the doors until the police showed up. After about 10 to 15 minutes, the cops showed up and began knocking on the neighbor's door. We sat in the living room quietly, trying to see if we could hear any of the conversations that were going to occur. Suddenly, we heard shouting and what seemed like a brief struggle, or I guess sudden movement. Looking through the people, my dad told us that they were taking the guy out of the apartment in handcuffs. We eventually found out after several hours of investigators, firemen, and ambulances that the couple were severely intoxicated and had lots of paraphernalia in the house. Apparently, the larger guy attacked the woman who was now unconscious due to her injuries. Apparently, when the cops arrived, he was just watching TV like nothing had happened. My parents told me that they eventually heard their neighbor was okay for the most part and that she wouldn't suffer many long-standing injuries from this encounter. My parents were out of that apartment as quick as possible and now live in a spacious house that is much more accommodating for holidays. But at least once a year when we were all together, we bring up that night and discuss just how scary and traumatizing it really was. This is my first time posting this story anywhere. I hope you can learn from this experience and apply it if, God forbid, this were to ever happen to you. I work for a company that forces me to travel a lot. I usually fly, but because I know how crazy airports are on holidays, I thought it would be a smarter decision to rent a car and drive home overnight, avoiding the nightmare that would be an airport on Thanksgiving week. I started the drive home, and even though I was a little tired, I was able to cruise from about 11 p.m. until 3 a.m., as there were barely any cars on the road. Shortly after 3 a.m., I saw a van that was sideways in the middle of the road on the highway. Thankfully, I had my brights on and was able to see the vehicle with plenty of time for a safe stop. There was also an elderly woman near the side of the road who was waving me down. Cautiously, I slowed down and came to a stop. The woman walked up to my window, motioning for me to roll it down. I rolled it down the slightest bit, making sure even her hand couldn't get in the car. In an old cracking voice, she said, "Young man, can you please help me change my tire?" I glanced over and saw that she did indeed have a flat tire. She said to me again, "I ran over something and my tire became flat almost instantly," and motioned to what looked like a piece of plastic in the road. I reluctantly got out of the car and walked by the van and said she needed to move it to the side of the road for safety. I told her that there was no way we could change a tire in the middle of a highway in the middle of the night. She agreed and moved it out of the road into the side of the highway. As I began to change the tire, I had a million things running through my mind. Number one being, why did I have to be the one who got flagged down? I was almost finished taking the flat tire off when I noticed I didn't see the woman anymore, as I was providing my own light source with my cell phone, and looked up to ask if she could assist, and she was gone. I looked all around the vehicle and didn't see anybody. Nothing but pitch black darkness other than my headlights, which were providing some light in the general direction. Well, lucky for me, I had my keys in my pocket and locked my car door when I got out. I walked back over to my car and the woman was there trying to get into my vehicle. I told her to get away from my car before I called the police. She laughed at me and said it would be at least 30 minutes until anyone showed up to where we were. Just as I was trying to get this crazy person away from my car so I could leave, I noticed a man get out of the van. He must have been laying on the floor because I didn't see anybody sitting in the seats when I walked by to begin the process of changing her flat. The man seemed to be of average build. He started to approach me, his hand in his pocket, which really started to make me worry about my safety. The woman then jumped on my back and attempted to choke me. I was able to shake her off quickly and elbow her directly in the throat. She began to cough and gasp incessantly, which gave me the break I needed to get away. The guy who was approaching us devoted his attention to her, and I got in that car and sped away as fast as I could. I have never driven that fast in my entire life. The adrenaline from the events fueled me for the remainder of my trip home. I know if someone else told me this story, I would ask how dumb can you be and emphasize how idiotic of a decision it was to get out of that car. I'm just glad that I was able to get out of that situation unharmed and get home to my family. After police reports were called, I unfortunately never got any further information. I wish I would have glanced at their plates. That may have helped in identifying them later. And please let this be a lesson to everyone out there. Trust your instincts, especially in situations that can affect your safety. This story may seem more weird than truly scary to many of you. At the time, I didn't really find it scary or terrifying myself. I didn't really get that feeling until I shared this with others and got their perspective. I'd be interested to see what, if any, comments any of you have regarding this experience. This event happened with my ex-girlfriend on Thanksgiving about 6 years ago. For the sake of anonymity, we will call her Kay. I met Kay in college, and at first, she was great. We shared similar interests and hobbies. We clicked instantly, and for the first time, I was excited to meet the parents of my significant other. I was going to meet them on Thanksgiving so that everyone could have dinner together. Kay never really mentioned her family, so I was excited and intrigued when she asked me to join her for the holiday. Fast forward a week or so, and Thanksgiving finally comes. I make the 2-hour drive to her parents' house, and my first thought as I approached the house is, wow, this place is huge. It was a gigantic brown mansion. It was very large, but also looked very old. My best comparison is if you have ever seen the movie Clue. The outside of the house looked very similar to that, a mix between mansion and castle almost. I knocked on the door and almost immediately was greeted by a strange-looking guy. He was short, like 5 foot flat. He was bald and wearing an eye patch. I said, "Hey, is Kay here? I'm her boyfriend." He just proceeded to look at me and didn't answer. After a few awkward seconds, Kay walked over and happily greeted me and let me inside. As we walked away, she said in her soft voice, "Oh, don't mind him, that's just Eugene. He's like, I guess, kind of my uncle." Kind of weird way to put it, I thought, but whatever, I didn't think too much of it. As we walked through the house, I was blown away. I'd never seen anything like it. The ceilings were really high and the walls were covered with religious iconography. I wasn't raised with religion, so some of the images were foreign to me. Kay and I arrived and sat in what I assumed was the living room. There was no TV, no radio, just couches and some paintings all over the wall. The paintings seemed to cram together, trying to fit them all on the wall. An odd choice for such a nice home. After a couple of minutes, her parents walked in. Her dad was clean-shaven with wild flowing hair and glasses that were just big enough for his eyeballs, and her mom had long black hair that went all the way down to her back and reached her legs. It looked like they were in their mid-60s if I had to guess. I was introduced and we made small talk. It really wasn't that bad, there was no awkward pauses, but her parents were not what I expected. They seemed a little strange or eccentric, I guess. While the 4 of us talked basically about school, Eugene came and stood in the doorway and began watching us. After a few more minutes of talking about school, her dad got up and said he had a surprise for us. He walked into the other room and brought out a lime green stereo boombox that looked like something straight out of the 90s. In his almost comical voice, he said, "This one is for you two. I hope you like it. It used to be Kay's favorite." I looked at Kay and she was smiling. I can't even imagine what my face looked like. Confused, surprised, however that translates to a face. He pressed play on the stereo. Music began to play and her dad started to dance with her mom. The music, if that's what you would want to call it, was the weirdest thing I had ever heard in my entire life. It was just like banging of instruments, very untuned instruments and other loud noises that honestly sounded like animals. Even more weird than the song that was playing were the movements of her parents. They just hopped around and were moving their bodies like they were puppets on strings or something. Thankfully, this only lasted a few minutes and we all sat down to dinner. Of course, the dining room was no different than the rest of the house. There were paintings and religious images all over the walls. We ate dinner in a combination of silence and her dad talking about politics and religion and how they were separate yet similar. I basically just stayed quiet and ate my food, which, looking back, was pretty unconventional for Thanksgiving dinner. After the meal, we went back into the living room, and that's when her father told us he had one last surprise for us. In his high-pitched voice, he shouted, "It's now time for our annual Thanksgiving Day celebration." As I sat on the couch and tried to process what that could possibly mean, I noticed that more people were walking into the room. There was somebody dressed as a scarecrow, a teddy bear, a lumberjack, and one other that I think was supposed to be Jesus or some other religious figure. This is when I decided that I had had enough crazy for one night and had to get out of this place. I got up and announced to everyone that I had a family emergency and that I had to leave unexpectedly. I apologized and thanked them for everything thus far and said how happy I was to have met everyone. They all looked a little confused, especially Kay, but they shared their happiness in meeting me and their enjoyment of the night and wished me well on my drive home. As I drove away, I looked through my rearview mirror. I saw Kay and her parents waving goodbye to me from the doorway. Where to begin? This is the weirdest, strangest few hours of my life. I am obviously no longer with Kay, and I honestly am not sure she even came back to school after that because I never saw her in person again. We texted for a few days after the event, and she acted like everything was normal. I broke it off before holiday break was over, thinking it would be easier to do so before I saw her in person again. I swear part of me thinks I was on a hidden camera TV show that night or something. Does anyone from a rare religious sect know if any of this is a common tradition? Or was I just in a house with a bunch of crazy people on Thanksgiving? I just wanted to share this short but freaky experience I had with my family many years ago on Thanksgiving. This Thanksgiving, my cousins and I got together with our respective families. I was the oldest of the cousins, 11 at the time. This particular year, our families decided to go to my great-aunt's house for dinner. It was a small little farmhouse pretty much in the middle of nowhere. No one liked going there, well, at least us kids, because it was boring and there was nothing to do. My great-aunt had recently lost her husband and obviously was very upset, which is mostly the reason our families decided to go there this year. I met my great-aunt maybe once or twice in my entire life to this point, so I found this whole trip very weird and really wasn't looking forward to it. Before dinner, all of us kids decided we wanted to play hide and seek. Our parents let us because we could be out of their way, and as previously mentioned, there was nothing else for us to do. My cousin and I went into the basement of the house to hide. There was so much junk and old antiques down there that we could have stayed hidden and out of sight for hours. I climbed to the top of a pile of old newspapers that was backed against a dimly lit wall. I figured if I laid flat at the top, there was no way anyone could find me. Well, after a few minutes, one of my cousins did find me, and when I tried to get down, my foot got caught on something, and I slipped and fell off the side and put a small hole in the wall. At first, we were freaked out because we thought we were going to get in a lot of trouble for doing damage to the house. While we were trying to think of a story to cover it up and get ourselves out of trouble, my brother found a small box on the other side of the wall where I had recently put the hole. We pulled the box out and stared at it for a while, trying to see if we could open it. It had an entire layer of dust on it that didn't come off when we tried to blow on it. My cousin Sarah was fearless, and she grabbed the box from us and opened it. At first, we all felt like we won the lottery. It was filled with 20s, 50s, and 100s. We were young, but we knew this was a lot of money. As we looked through the money, we eventually got to the bottom of the box, and this is where the excitement vanished. There was a small knife that looked like it had dried blood on it, and next to it was what looked like a skeletal finger or maybe even a toe. Of course, we all screamed and ran upstairs crying to our parents. Our parents looked at us very confused as to what happened. We all tried to blurt out our version of the story until, as calm as can be, my great-aunt giggled and said, "Oh, that's just Bob's box from when he used to mess around with his army buddies. I haven't seen that since his friend Raymond passed away." Well, fast forward years later, this story came up again, and we all tried to figure out what all that meant and what we actually found. After consulting with our family, the story goes that our great-uncle Bob was involved in all sorts of crime in the Chicago area. He made a lot of dirty money and eventually gave it up when he had a family. Our family didn't have an answer as to the contents of the box or whose missing finger that could possibly be. Every year for Thanksgiving, my wife and I travel to her parents' house to relax for a few days, watch football, eat tons of food, and go Black Friday shopping. 2 years ago, I was unable to make this trip due to an incident that happened with one of our dogs. On Tuesday night of Thanksgiving week around 11 p.m., I let our golden retriever out to go to the bathroom before I went upstairs to bed for the night. When I came back outside to let her in, she was barking very violently, sounding like she was going after another animal. When she made it into the garbage, it was apparent what happened. She had been sprayed in the face by a skunk. Fast forward 24 hours and we are dealing with a house and a dog that reeks like skunk. Needless to say, I offered to stay home with the 2 dogs while my wife made the trip to her parents. We couldn't travel with the dog, and we certainly needed to do some maintenance to try and get the smell out of the house. My wife left on Wednesday, the same day I took the dog to the groomers and began cleaning and airing out the house. After this experience, I felt it necessary to go outside with the dogs every time I left them out in the backyard, whether it was day or night, to make sure there were no further issues with a skunk. I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary until Wednesday night, when it seemed like our shed doors had been opened slightly. Since it was that time of the year where it got dark out very early in the day, I had grown accustomed to having a flashlight with me to check the backyard before I let the dogs out. Unfortunately, we didn't have a motion light or any sort of light for the backyard, so the only source of light was the flashlight. With the dog still in the garage, I made my way to the shed to see why or what caused the door to be ajar. When I got into the shed, I thankfully didn't see any skunk or any other animal. I did, however, see a dirty towel, which I didn't remember leaving there, but I thought perhaps it was from when I was working on the lawnmower or snowblower. The next 20-ish hours went by without incident. I was spending Thanksgiving alone with my stinky dog in my stinky house, and we were getting ready to go to bed for the night. I did my normal routine of going outside with the flashlight, making sure the coast was clear before I let the dogs out of the garage. However, this time, as I was moving my flashlight across my large backyard, I flashed it towards the side of the shed to illuminate if there was anything behind it. Absolute panic set in as I saw a hooded figure behind the shed. I instinctively started to yell at the figure, asking what they were doing. By the time I went back to the garage to let our dogs out to go after the intruder, he was gone, and there was no one in my backyard. Freaked out, I contacted my wife to let her know what I had seen. She advised me to call the cops, but I decided I would just monitor the backyard for a while and ignore it if nothing further happened. About an hour later, I decided to take the flashlight and go to the window in my kitchen and shine it out into the backyard rather than go outside first. When I did this, the shine of the light caught the same hooded figure going into the shed and shutting the door behind them. At this point, I didn't know what to do. Let the dogs out, call the cops, confront the person myself. I honestly was frozen in shock. Trying to think quickly, and not wanting the person to get away, I grabbed a screwdriver to jam into the openings in the handles to prevent the shed door from opening from the inside. After I did this, I immediately called the police. The person was slamming on the shed, trying anything they could to get out. When the police arrived, they took him away. Thankfully, from the conversation I had with them, he didn't have any weapons on him. I'm not sure what the intent of the person was. Were they just trying to scare me? Were they drunk from drinking all day from Thanksgiving and didn't know where they were? I still have many unanswered questions from that night, including if the person was in the shed the night before and that's why it was left ajar. Perhaps he was just a squatter. Either way, there was no further incident after this issue, and thankfully my dog has also remained skunk-free since then. We now have motion lights installed in our backyard, which will hopefully prevent anyone from trying to break in to our property again. I have worked in retail for many years, and one of my least favorite days to work is Black Friday. Our store is packed to the brim. People are freaking out trying to get their items, and it is very rare to get through the night without any incident. One particular Black Friday sticks out in my memory due to an experience that I had with a customer. I was working out on the floor assisting customers with any questions that they may have had regarding our products or our sales. I had this one customer approach me to complain about not getting a ticket towards one of our better TV offers. I apologized and tried to explain that the tickets had been given out on Thursday night and there was nothing I could do at this point. The customer smelled so bad I could barely get this information out to them without gagging. His clothes were stained and his appearance was ragged. After I explained the scenario to him one more time, a large smile came across his face and he said, "I know it's not your fault, sweetie." I was beyond creeped and grossed out. I let him know that I had to go help other customers and I hope he had a good conclusion to his evening. A short time later, I got a call up to register to try and assist with the long lines, and wouldn't you know it, I was cashing out the same guy who had been complaining to me just 15 to 20 minutes prior. He began chatting with me, ignoring the fact that he had been irate with me minutes before. He asked my name, even though I had a name tag on, how long I had worked there, how old I was, etc. As I previously mentioned, this person smelled horrific and also began to seriously creep me out with their random questioning. He asked how late I had to work, and I stated that all employees had to stay until midnight due to the fact that we were so busy. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have told him anything. He continued with more creepy questions, and I finally got him out of my line and moved on to the next customers. Fast forward to a few hours later, and I'm finally getting ready to leave after an exhausting day. I walked out to the parking lot with my coworker Matt and said goodbye to him and that I would see him on Sunday. As I made my way to my car, I thought it was unusually quiet, especially for how busy it had been throughout the day, but it was past midnight, so most stores were closed. As I was approaching my car, a set of headlights began to shine in my direction. Blinded by the light, I just proceeded to unlock my car and reach for the handle to get in and leave. The next thing I know, the headlights had made their way right in front of my car and someone was putting their car in park and getting out. To my utter shock and horror, it was the same slovenly customer who had creeped me out earlier in the night. At this point, I started fearing for my safety as this person clearly wasn't all there upstairs. He had parked in front of my car and left his car running, blocking me from going anywhere. We got out of the car and I asked if I could help him and what he was doing blocking my car. He mentioned something along the lines that I needed to come with him and that we belonged together. At this point, I tried to make my way back to the store, but the guy pressed his body weight against me and pressed me against my own car. I couldn't move and was trapped. Fearing for my life, I began to scream as he covered my mouth. His hands somehow smelled worse than his body odor. He began to try and move me towards his car, still trying to muffle my screams while dragging me with his other arm. Just when I thought I was going to be overpowered, a car horn began to honk incessantly. He let go of me and hopped in his car and sped off as quickly as he had arrived. The car that was honking then pulled up to me, and it was Matt. Thankfully, on his way out, he had noticed that there was a car blocking mine in, and as he got closer, saw that there was someone grabbing me. He immediately got on the phone with the police and began honking as he came over to my side of the parking lot. Matt waited with me for the police to arrive so that we could each give a statement. The cops requested to get into the store so that we could check the camera footage in order to try to get a better view of the guy who had stalked me for the night. To my knowledge, they never caught him, or at least he was never charged. I haven't heard anything from the incident, but I am thankful that I had never seen that person again. And I'm very thankful to Matt for saving me that night. I've always wondered what could have happened if he hadn't been there. For a little bit of background related to this incident, I am a former athletic director of a small elementary school which also sponsors high school basketball teams. This particular event happened on Thanksgiving night 3 years ago. After I had a delicious meal on Thanksgiving with my family, my wife decided she wanted to go Black Friday shopping, so I decided to go to the gymnasium and start setting up for Friday morning. Every Thanksgiving weekend, our gym hosts a Thanksgiving basketball tournament for a handful of local high school teams. It was becoming a pretty well-recognized tradition in our community. Anyway, I spent about an hour or so setting up chairs, bleachers, prepping concessions, and getting the equipment in order. This was perfect because I could now sleep in a little tomorrow morning and not have to worry about rushing to the gym and set up. To try and give you a visual setup of the gym and its surroundings, it is a very small gym with one set of main doors that leads into a small elementary school. The school is very old and the hallways are lined with brick. If I'm being honest, it reminds me of an old prison. The lighting in the halls is dim, even in the daylight, due to lack of windows in its construction. The school apparently used to be a home for nuns in the 1930s, and I don't think it's structurally been updated very much since. In my opinion, it's a pretty creepy place. I've been in this place probably 100 times myself, and it still gives me an eerie feeling. Once I finished all my prep work for the tournament, I decided to shut the place down and go home for the night. I went into the far corner of the gym to the circuit breaker and shut off all the lights. At this point, the gym was lit by only moonlight and the glow of street lights shining in through the large gym windows. I walked into the small hallway that was basically pitch black at this point, using my cell phone flashlight to avoid running into a wall. As I walked down the long hall towards the exit, I started to hear a scratching noise. I stopped walking to try and locate the source of the noise because it was very loud and distinct. It sounded like it was coming from one of the classrooms up ahead. As I pointed my cell phone flashlight up the hall, I noticed that one of the classroom doors were open. This was odd because the policy was that all the doors were to be locked when the teachers left for the evening. Admittedly, I was a little spooked, thinking possibly an animal had gotten into the classroom or something else. But the only way to leave was passing the door in the hall to get to the main entrance, which was probably another 30 feet away. I continued down the hall, my eyes sharp to try and find the source of the noise that has now gone silent. As I passed that room, I saw something, and it definitely was not an animal. It was a green figure, a tall green silhouette of a man wearing a button-up shirt, parted hair, and long pants. And I mean tall. It was probably standing about 6.5 feet. It was just standing there, hovering, staring out the door, staring at me. It didn't move or make any noise. Its face was impossible to make out, like staring into the abyss. In the brief moment that I stood there frozen in fear, I felt very cold, like a window had been opened. I don't know why I didn't just run. I think my brain was trying to process if this was a human intruder, or if I was witnessing something I couldn't rationalize. I snapped back to reality and began to sprint down the hall, looking back once more as I ran out the main entrance, now seeing the figure in the hallway. I drove home as fast as I possibly could, not able to get the image of the figure out of my head. Of course, as you would expect every time I relay this story to my family or friends, people either think it's a joke or that I'm trying to scare them. For the rest of that year, I never went to the property by myself after dark. I came and went out the back entrance that was not supposed to be used in order to avoid that hallway. After the season was over, I resigned and appointed someone else to my position. I can't tell you what I saw or experienced that night, but I hope nothing like that ever happens to me again.